Yes, I had about three uncles, I think, that lived. My dad was too old to. He was 36 when the war broke out, so he didn't. And he was too young for World War I. But one of the uncles served in Washington they had a forest rangers group or something that he was in, and one uncle was served at the Dominican Republic. He was a Marine and very proud of it. And then the other uncle I never met because he was in World War I, and he came home, and he was in the wintertime, and he had his car, and he got stuck, and instead of getting out of the car, he stepped out and had the door open and trying to push it that way, and the door closed on him and it killed him. So he was very young when he died. So outside of that, that's all I can think of. Probably good riddance. No, they didn't want it to happen, but things happen. So I didn't want it to happen either. I was drafted, and we were sent to Minneapolis to be inducted, and we spent the first night in a hotel there. There was about a 50, 60, more than that at the time, and the hotel rooms, they had cots in them. There was 8 men to a hotel room, and it was pretty crowded. And then the next day they loaded us on Greyhound buses. There was 2 of them to go to Chicago to be inducted at Fort Sheridan. And on the way there, one of the buses broke down about an hour out of Chicago. So they had put all those other guys, and we had about 100 guys in one bus. And we get into Chicago, and they put us in these barracks. It was unbelievable. The bunks were stacked 3 high, and about 500 men in a room. And after that, they loaded us up on a train, and they had the whole train chartered. It was all Pullman cars with a kitchen car, and they went to Seattle, Fort Lewis. And on the way, they'd stop once in a while. You'd get out and do calisthenics, and I couldn't believe when we would eat. You went from one end of the train to the other, and then you come back, and the kitchen was in the center of the train, so you had to make the complete circle. But what surprised me, they had wood-fired cook stoves on the train. but they were Pullman trains, the ones where you pull the bunks down. They were really comfortable. It took about 3 days to get to Fort Lewis, and the train pulled right in on the fort. There was a railroad track. So then they put us in where we were supposed to be, and come to find out that somehow on my records, there was 2 of us that our records were disappeared. They didn't have any records, so we were in limbo for a couple of weeks. And all the group that went with me were already 2 weeks in basic training, so that I was put into another artillery company for basic training, and that probably saved my life because the Korean War ended while I was in basic training. So after that, spent the rest of my time at Fort Lewis.
That experience was like?
Oh, well, some of the things they did, you'd have to go out and sleep in a foxhole, and one time they had special foxholes that you went in, and then they run over you with a tank, so you had the experience of what to do when a tank was coming at you. And it was kind of interesting, and then you got to ride on the back of the tanks. And outside of that, I was actually in an artillery company, but they didn't do any artillery training until the second 8 weeks, and I was on an 8-week cycle, and then I was wound up in division headquarters. Well, when I got done basic training, I don't know if there was some diploma. There wasn't diplomas, but they had a farewell thing, and somebody asked, you know how to type? And I says, I raised my hand, and he said, okay. Well, I wound up in division headquarters. It was, at that time, it was the Illinois 44th Infantry Division National Guard. And all of the other people that were inducted with me, the most of them were shipped off to Korea. And but then I was put into the what they call the AWOL and apprehension section of the division, and there was a 3-man crew, and I was on the bottom of the list. I was doing all the typing, and it was an interesting job. You were required to make contact with each company commanders and that, and make sure to get their morning reports and go over for the AWOLs, and if they were gone over 30 days, they were classified as deserters. And when if they were apprehended, then if they were a deserter, you would have to call the company commander and have him appoint 2 men to go and pick them up. Then they always, when we called the company commanders, we always mentioned that if you had some men that lived in that area, it would be a nice trip for them, because we allow a 3-day delay en route so that they can visit. And one time there was one in Chicago, so I thought, well, maybe I should sign up. And I got there. We went to Chicago. Well, on the way, I got off the train in Minneapolis, and then when I left for Chicago, I left out of Duluth, so I had a 3-day pass at home. And then we went to Fort Sheridan and picked up this. He was just a young kid who was just scared to death, I guess. And so I picked him up, and then you had to handcuff him, and we were armed and had 45 revolvers. So I told the kid, I said, there's 2 ways you can travel with me. I said, one, you can ride in the coach with me, or you can ride in the baggage car 40 feet first. Didn't have any trouble with him. So outside of that, later on, I was promoted a couple of times, and then I was the chief of the AWOL and apprehension section, and it was an interesting job, and you had a lot of contact with a lot of different people. And
where did you live, and what was the base like at that time?
Well, when I first went on the base, they had a nice brick 2-story barracks that had nice clean hallways and really clean restrooms and all that, and it was right next to the headquarters building, and so they just have to get up after chow and walk over to work. And but then later on, the 44th Infantry Division was deactivated, and the 2nd Infantry Division returned from Korea, and they took over for the 44th. So then when all these guys come back from Korea, they kicked all of us headquarters people out of the barracks, and I had these old wooden barracks right behind, and that's where I spent the rest of the time. And so all in all, it was, I don't regret being there, and had a lot of good fellowship. And well, I'd planned to go to college, and I did start college, and then I didn't have the prerequisites to what I wanted to major in, so I dropped out after a short period of time and went back to where the company I worked for, I had 90 days to get back to them before I would lose my seniority. And so I went back to work, and I worked for them 37 years, and then I wound up in Bella Vista. At that time, it was called Wood Conversion Company, and they had 3 different divisions. They used to make an insulation called balsam wool, which they sold all over the country. And then the other division was a ceiling tile, like you see in all these 2x4 things hanging down. And we had the largest manufacturing facility in the world for that, and machinery. And then the division I worked in was called the bonded fiber division. We made a cushioning type material and a sound deadening, and I was involved in that. I started out as a tester, and I worked my way up to the manager. And then we were taken over by during one of these hostile takeover things, and we had a plant in New Jersey, and I was transferred to New Jersey, and I was the only one that was transferred, so I worked there for 3 years, and then I retired and moved to Bella Vista. Probably not to be as shy as I used to be. You know, I used to be, I couldn't even answer the telephone sometimes. But outside of that, all in all, it was good for me, I think, and good for the country. I belong to the American Legion. I joined in 1955, but then when I moved to New Jersey, I let my dues lapse, and then when I moved to Bella Vista, they had a guy that everybody in town knew. His name was Marshall Sander, and he was a Legion not computer. Yeah. What am I trying to say? Go around soliciting and getting memberships, and I don't think I even got out of the car before he wasn't rapping on my door, and he says, "You belong to Legion?" I says, "I used to." And he says, "Oh, it's good enough," he says. So he signed me up, and I've been a member of the one here for 37 years. Or not 37, 35 years. So that's my experience. My wife belonged to the auxiliary, and we were quite active for a number of years, but I haven't been in the past 15 years or so. Yeah. But my wife was, one year, she was the National Woman of the Year for the American Legion. My wife and I volunteered at the VA hospital in Fayetteville for about 14 years, and that was a good experience. So,
oh, really? What did you do there?
Well, I worked in the X-ray department, and I just filed the records and all that, and checked people in. But it was an interesting, and there were good people to be around. That's when I got released from the service in 1955, and the second lieutenant there was handing out the discharge papers, and I got the envelope with discharge papers and a $100 bill, and goodbye. So, well, I thought it was great. It was a good experience. You heard the term, they're going to have cut orders for something. Well, that cut orders meant we used to have to type, you didn't have any photograph or Xerox machines or anything. We used to type, I don't know if you ever heard of it, but these mimeograph machines, we would have typed stencils, and then that's how it got, they cut the stencil so they could print the order. Yeah, mostly typing and that, and if you typed something in, you'd have to have an officer sign it, and one time we had a warrant officer, and that's a chief warrant of CWO, and you used to have to type in his name and then his rank. So one time I typed up a letter for him to sign, and instead of CWO, I put COW. So he come back and he says, "I'm not a cow." I said, "Well, you are now."